here for that. Okay. So welcome to the second Val Gardens Rent Control Workshop. We had our first workshop on December 9th of last year. Went very well attended, just like today. We have participants both here physically and also online. So if anybody is not able to physically come in or prefer to be online, they are also participating with us today. Well, our senior manager in Alice, Mr. Silas Soto, will be helping with the chat online. So everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions and also to give public testimony. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, one. So just some logistics. We have a sign-in sheet back here. So please provide your contact information if you'd like us to reach out to you. Also, we have the agenda and the proposed tenant protection provisions back there. It's a summary of them, both in English and Spanish. If you get an agenda in English, the back is in Spanish. And also some food out there if you'd like to grab some lunch, some coffee, some cookies, chips. And at the end, and also throughout the workshop, we have these resource booths, volunteers outside that are here to help you with any questions you might have with regards to housing. We have the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, Stay House LA, and also the Housing Rights Center, and the Bell Gardens Family Center as a resource for you. So again, throughout the workshop, from 12, we'll be here till 3 o'clock. Feel free to go out there, ask questions, get a private meeting with them, and just gather the information that they provide you. But again, this workshop is from 12 to 2 p.m. So after 2 p.m., they'll be completely open for you. Okay. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and do some introductions here. We have our rent control ad hoc committee here. We have our chair, Mr. Marco, Councilmember Marco Barcena. We have our co-chair, Councilwoman Alejandra Cortez. We have our committee member, Mr. Don Jervis Jr. Our committee member, Ms. Emily Nava, and also our committee member, Ms. Lucia Veros. They represent both the tenant and the landlord side. So there's a total of 7 committee members. Unfortunately, 2 of them couldn't be with us today. However, they might be participating online. So back when we started this, about 2 years ago in 2019, if you recall, the state governor signed a bill into law in September of 2019. It was Assembly Bill 1482. It was meant to provide rent control statewide. In 2020, January of 2020, that law came into effect. So now everyone in California has rent control. Your landlord, your property owner is limited to raising your rent no more than 5% per year, plus the cost of inflation, but it cannot go over 5%. Unfortunately, right now, the cost of inflation is at 6% and above. So your maximum rent can be raised by 10% right now. Okay. However, the city of Bell Gardens, as well as other cities, they wanted to see if the state law was enough. And they said, let's go ahead and take a look at it, give it a year to look at and see what's happening. But then the pandemic hit. And we had some eviction moratoriums that were set in place by the state and county. So we set that aside because the tenants are being protected. At least we thought so until the restrictions went away. So now we're back to tenants being able to get their rent raise. But again, you're limited to 10% per year. We also wanted to provide an opportunity to see if there's additional provisions that the city can adopt. So not only is there a rent increase, but also other provisions in place. And that summary that there is going to be reviewed by our city attorney, Ms. Norma Tavares. We also have 3 panelists that are experts in the field. So they're going to be talking to you today and giving us their comments, their opinion. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce first Ms. Norma Tavares, who's our city attorney, and she's our expert in the field of landlord-tenant relations. She's a lady right on the right screen, right-hand corner. And then we have also Miss Katie McKeon down below. I'm going to give you a quick introduction of it. Katie is a staff attorney at Public Counsel, where she works with community-based organizations and community coalitions to advance racial and economic justice through community-driven planning and housing policies. She's worked with a number of communities and community groups that have advocated for rent stabilization policies, including groups that have launched ballot initiative campaigns, like the Mountain View and Burbank, and also the groups that engage successfully with local city councils and boards, like in LA County and Culver City. Katie is a graduate of Stanford University and Stanford Law School. Welcome, Katie, and thank you for helping us out with this. We also have Mr. Shane Phelps. He manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative for UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. Mr. Phillips, in his role, supports faculty and student research, manages events, and publishes research policy briefs and educational materials. His work covers a wide range of housing topics, including tenant protections, housing production policies, and government revenue and financing reforms. Shane's also the author of a book called The Affordable City, Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach and Teaching It. In this book, he argues for an all-of-the-above approach to housing policy and outlines 55 strategies for improving affordability and housing stability. It's published in a variety of outlets, including the Atlantic and Los Angeles Times, and it gets blogged occasionally at www.betterinstitutions.com. And finally, we have a new panelist that did not participate with us the last workshop, and he's here representing the landlord side, but also he has some views on tenant protection. Mr. Michael Fiorina. He is the CEO of Total Commercial Real Estate Corporation, a properties and facilities management company that manages retail centers, office space, and over 10,000 multifamily units. He serves state and federal courts as a rents, issues, and profits receiver and partition referee. He's a member of the State Bar of California, U.S. District Court, Central District Court, Central District of California, and D.C. Court of Appeals. He's also an instructor at UCLA Extension School of Business, Management, and Legal programs, teaching those 3 courses. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over now to our legal expert, Ms. Norma Tavares, and City Attorney. She will be going over the tenant protections that are being proposed. So, if you look at your material, you're going to find something like this. Okay? That'll go over the summary of what's been proposed to the city of Bell Garden to adopt as part of the rent control ordinance. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with Ms. Tavares. Tavares, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gus. I appreciate the introduction. Am I being heard okay?
Yes.
Super, thank you so much. Yeah, once again, my name is Norma Tavares. I'm Assistant City Attorney for the City of Bell Gardens, and I'm glad to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to members of the community, so thank you. As Gus mentioned, today I'll be providing an overview of the proposed new rent control and tenant protection regulations that are being considered by the City of Bell Gardens, as well as a brief background of relevant state laws. So in terms of what gives the city the authority to pass rent control regulations, that's conferred by the city's broad police powers under the California Constitution, so long as it has a specific public benefit, which in this case, the intended purpose would be addressing high rents and affordability, reducing housing instability and displacement of its residents, as well as other tenant protections. At the same time, that would be balanced against not ensuring that regulations do not constitute an unconstitutional taking. So it would have to take into consideration landlords' reasonable rate of return. So in terms of big picture, broad strokes, any local regulations that the city passes would have to be consistent and comply with existing state law. And there's a couple that are worth mentioning. First, the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act that was passed in way back in 1995, which essentially limited the scope of units that are subject to rent control. And the ones that are most frequently cited are being single family homes, condominiums, as well as some commercial units. That law also established that vacancy decontrol, meaning that a landlord is allowed to increase the rent for incoming tenants to the market rate when somebody moves out of a unit. Also worth mentioning is the Ellis Act, which is another state law that essentially gives owners the right to take their property off the market by repurposing it for other legitimate uses, most common of which would be owner occupying the unit for themselves or converting it to condominiums, as well as other restricted uses. And then finally, as Gus mentioned, the Tenant Protection Act was passed in 2019, which established statewide rent control with certain limitations that will be discussed in more detail here today. So community groups here in the city, what happened was community groups submitted a proposal enumerating a series of tenant protections for the city of Bell Gardens to institute. And in response, the city formed an ad hoc committee who has studied the issue carefully and considered all of the proposals. And there was a total of 32 that ranged from placing restrictions on rent increases and grounds for eviction, penalties for bad actions, and other complementary policies to strengthen tenant protections. Things like registration of rental units, targeted benefits for specific groups, and more robust noticing requirements. Of the 32, the committee has identified 5 major proposals that are being considered for a potential new rent control ordinance in the city. And those 5 proposals are as follows. Number 1, lowering the caps on annual rent increases. Again, all of these are beyond what's already established by state law. So number 2, expanding the units that are covered and subject to rent control. Number 3, establishing a city level rent board. Number 4, limiting grounds for eviction to certain enumerated reasons. And then number 5, restricting evictions, no fault evictions for targeted groups, specifically households with school-aged children, as well as school staff during the school year. And I'm going to go into each one of those into a little bit more detail. So the first one is capping an annual rent increase beyond what's covered already by state law. So as Gus mentioned, state law already allows landlords to increase rent 5% in addition to the regional CPI or inflation rate, up to a maximum of 10% for units that are subject to rent control. It also allows landlords to raise the rent twice per year. Whereas the city, the proposal that the city's considering would allow a rent increase only once per year and cap rent increases to no more than 50% of CPI up to a maximum of 3%. So that would be more restrictive than state law. Second proposal that is one of the key proposals that are being considered is expanding the number of units or the type of units that are covered in order to allow as many units as possible to be subject to rent control. And the proposal lists things such as apartments, townhomes, duplexes, 2 or more single family homes on the same lot, some temporary housing where tenants live there on a long-term basis, residential units that are attached to commercial buildings, as well as others. And again, some of the state laws exempt many types of housing. And so the idea here is that we want to cover the maximum amount of legally allowable units. Third proposal would be to establish a rent board, a local rent board. And this is not something that is mandated or covered under current state law. And what's being proposed is that the city create a new 5-member board to implement the ordinance. Their responsibilities would include announcing the annual allowable increases. And the board would be either elected or appointed. And if appointed, the idea would be that it would be representative of city demographics along the lines of gender, race, immigration status, income, languages, etc. And other responsibilities of this rent board would be things such as disseminating know your rights information and maintaining unit registries in the city. Currently, there is no rent board in the city, so it would be a new body that would become established if this were included in a city ordinance. Fifth major proposal under consideration is restricting the grounds for eviction so that it is, again, more protective than what's allowed under current state law. So state law allows for landlords to terminate with just cause, and there's certain enumerated legal reasons for that that fall under the category of at fault and no fault causes. The proposal that the city's considering would limit allowable reasons for at fault evictions to the following: not paying rent after written notice, 3 days written notice, and demanding rent payment, a material breach of rental agreement after a 10-day notice, and which would be an opportunity to cure. Third would be refusing reasonable access to the landlord under certain circumstances. Number 4 would be by creating a substantial nuisance or conducting illegal activity in the unit. And then the 5th reason, allowable reason, would be a failure to vacate under, again, limited circumstances that are enumerated in more detail in the proposal. And then finally, the 5th proposal that the city is considering to regulate would be to restrict no fault evictions for specific groups, namely prohibiting no fault eviction during the school year for households with school-aged children, as well as school staff. And the idea there is to prevent disruption during the school year. So just in quick summary, the key features of the regulation that's being considered, of regulations that are being considered under the local level would be which units should we cover, expanding the scope of allowable units, how to handle rent increases, do we, with regard to frequency, like how often and how much, caps and frequency, eviction protections, expanding it, where we would list out the reasons that are allowed for just cause, as well as including noticing and cure periods. Some procedural or administrative features, so things like establishing a rent board, noticing rent registries, things of that nature. And then 5th, other features, including targeted protections and benefits for specific groups. So at this point, I just want to emphasize that the city is still studying the issue, and nothing formal or specific is in place at this time. So we're really happy to see so much community participation and interest in this issue. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back to Gus and the panelists to share their comments and viewpoints on the proposed policies that are under consideration.
Thank you very much, Norma. I'd like to also present one additional ad hoc committee staff member. She's sitting in the back, so I didn't see her. Ms. Jasmine Gonzalez here. She's our nonprofit representative for our committee. Thank you for being here with us. So ladies and gentlemen, now that we've gone through this presentation from our city attorney to understand state law and the proposed tenant protection provisions. Yes. Can I be heard? Is everything okay? Okay. And again, to understand state law and the proposed tenant protection requests that are before you today. So I want to make sure that everybody takes a copy of that, which is back here, both in English and Spanish. Look over it. Any questions that you have on it, if you want to try to understand each provision, we're here for that purpose, to be able to explain it to you. Okay? Because when we go forward and we have our next ad hoc committee, we want to make sure that we receive all comments, many comments as we can from our public, both the tenants and the landlords. So now I'm going to go ahead. Oh, by the way, restrooms, if anybody needs them, they're through these doors. on my right side. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this over now to the panelists. Before I do that, I want you to know that in this agenda, we're going to have time for questions and answers. But if we don't get through all of the questions and answers, I'm going to go ahead and let you know that during the week, myself and our staff is available to meet with you. We can set up a time to meet individually and answer those questions. Because we know within 2 hours, it's very difficult to answer all the questions, especially when there's so much participation. So we want to make sure that we give you that time personally. Okay, so we're available throughout the week. So now, our panelists, we're going to start off with Ms. Katie McKeon. Katie, if you could provide your opinion and comments on what we just went over with our assistant city attorney.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. Is everybody in the room able to hear me?
Yes.
Great. Great. So I want to provide a little bit of background about me and my work, talk a little bit about why communities typically reach for rent control, talk a little bit about housing instability, and just make a few comments about the legality of rent control. But I want to keep it short so that we can get to as many questions as possible. So again, my name is Katie McEwen. I'm a staff attorney at Public Counsel. We're a legal aid organization that works in Los Angeles County. I have worked in a lot of different communities all across the state of California, including Mountain View, Inglewood, Glendale, Burbank, Pasadena, Culver City, Baldwin Park, and Los Angeles County to think about and help implement various rent control policies. So I've reviewed every rent control policy that's currently in effect across the state, and I've talked to lots of different folks in all of these different communities about why or why not we should have rent control in local cities. So I work with communities who have felt the long-term impacts of long-term housing instability, dealing with increasingly high rent increases and habitability issues. So I also work on other aspects of the housing crisis, which includes working to increase the production of affordable housing. So I know that Bell Gardens has been working on their housing element, which is a planning document which envisions how Bell Gardens is going to bring more housing into the city. And that's a really important aspect of addressing the housing crisis. It's absolutely essential to increase our housing supply across all cities in California, but that will take time. Rent control is the fastest, lowest cost way for a city to protect tenants from displacement and gentrification while we continue to build housing that is really affordable to residents of the cities. Now, the effects of housing instability, especially on low-income folks, is really well documented. Studies link unaffordable and unstable housing to lower levels of mental well-being, more doctor visits, increased risk of anxiety and depression, substance abuse, and suicide. The effects on children are also very well known. Frequent forced moves, which is what evictions are linked to lower test scores, lower metrics on emotional well-being, and with a really high percentage of children, of households with children in Bell Gardens, that's something that the city really needs to be thinking about. Now, rent control also empowers tenants to raise legitimate concerns about habitability. As the city attorney mentioned, rent control is not only about dealing with very fast rent increases by regulating those, slowing those rent increases down. It also regulates when a landlord can or cannot evict a tenant. And so if a tenant raises habitability issues, they have more protections against retaliation by their landlord. They cannot be evicted simply for raising habitability concerns, which is something that we do see relatively frequently in cities and in places where there is no just cause eviction protections. Now, rent control also provides more stability to low-income members of the community. It provides them with more security that they can stay in their neighborhoods long-term and be able to invest in their community, in their children's schools, in their community centers, their churches, and in the local governing process, just like what we're doing here right now. And when I say invest, I really mean financially invest as well in the local economy. If tenants can spend less money on housing and be more certain about what their rent is going to be in the future, they have more dollars to pay for food, transit, school supplies, and to patronize local businesses. So in terms of the legal underpinnings of rent control, the city attorney already covered a lot of that. But I just want to underscore that rent control has a very long history in the state of California. It's been consistently upheld as legal policy, and that has been reaffirmed in the last 4 or 5 years because we have seen a wave of cities implement rent control and landlord advocates suing those cities to try to challenge those policies. And the landlord advocates have been consistently denied their relief. And so these rent control policies have been upheld as legal. So to wrap up, rent control is a very important tool to stabilize the community that you have right now. As you move to implement solutions to the housing crisis that have a longer time horizon, again, mainly a lot of that is increasing the affordable housing stock, preserving the affordable housing that you do have, and dealing with habitability issues that may be present right now in the housing stock. So I'm happy to answer any legal or policy questions that folks have, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Appreciate your comments and opinions. Now we're going to go to our next panelist, Mr. Shane Phillips. Shane?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Great. So I guess I'll focus a little more here on some of the common concerns with rent control. And I'll preface this by saying, I personally think that rent stabilization is an appropriate local response in Southern California, but it is important to acknowledge what it can and can't do. And Katie got at some of this. Ultimately, the lack of rent control is not the fundamental reason for high or rising prices. And so instituting it is not the long-term solution to those issues. It can keep prices on some units from rising as quickly, and that's a really valuable intervention, especially for those who are directly benefiting from it. But it's not the same thing as making housing more affordable, which I think is all of our goal in the long run. I sort of think of it like giving someone painkillers when they're suffering from a debilitating disease. It's not a cure. And it comes with risks of its own, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. Even if it doesn't solve the underlying problem, it is important to treat immediate symptoms, even as you tackle underlying causes. And that's really what rent control can do. The underlying cause of high and rising prices in Southern California is a lack of homes. We have not built enough homes for decades. Market rate homes, subsidized homes, all of them. We have built far, far too little relative to the growth in our economy and all the people that have moved here and all the many more people who would have liked to move here. And that's a problem we've let fester and grow for at least 3 decades all across the state. And it will take a very long time to reverse the harm that we've done because of that. Policies like rent control are useful for managing these more immediate threats as we work toward long-term solutions. But and this is more of a challenge to the elected officials and other maybe advocates in Bell Gardens is if you approve rent control without addressing housing supply, without trying to tackle these underlying causes, you are ultimately just kicking the can down the road, and you can count on things getting worse over time and not better. So it really has to be sort of all of the above approach. And if someone is telling you that we can just fix our affordability problems with rent control alone, they are wrong. Nowhere has succeeded at doing just that, but it can be an important part of the solution. We can get into this in more detail later, but I just want to address some common arguments against rent control and why I think they're either wrong or don't apply in this context. Historically, folks tend to point toward places like New York that had rent control in the past, much stricter rent control in the past than they do now. And at the time, because of the way it was structured, it did do a lot of real harm. It led to rising prices for many people. It led to black markets, key money, and these kinds of things. It led to a wave of rentals being converted into condos and co-ops at a really high scale and with a lot of detrimental impacts. But there are two important differences here with rent stabilization in California that set it apart and give us what some people call second generation rent control. The first of those is you have something called vacancy decontrol, and this is mandated by the state. And it basically just means that landlords are able to charge whatever the market will bear for rent after the tenants move out. They're limited in how much they can increase rent each year for as long as a tenant stays in their unit, but they're able to catch up when that tenant moves out. With first generation rent control, like we saw in New York and some other places in the past, that reset to market rate often wasn't allowed. And there were some real downsides to that, including the problems I mentioned in New York. Second, the rent stabilization does not apply to new units. Again, state law prohibits that in California, and that is actually good policy. What it means is that arguments about rent control discouraging new development just really don't hold water. The reality is that no rational home builder is making decisions about what to build today based on their rents, based on their units being subject to rent stabilization 30 or more years in the future. What rent stabilization can do on the negative side, and at least on the margins, is encourage conversion of rentals to condos and other kinds of owner occupancy. There are rules cities can put in place to discourage that, or at least to guarantee some kind of compensation for tenants who are evicted as part of those conversions or owner move-ins. But it is important to acknowledge that it is a real issue. On the other hand, though, I think if you have a situation where tenants are paying below market rents and that leads to a landlord converting the building into a condo or a tenancy in common or what have you, and evicting the tenants, that's a pretty sure sign that the landlord would have been charging much higher rents if rent control hadn't been in place, in which case the tenants would have been harmed either way. So rent control is not really the fault here. It's just, it's actually something standing in the way of that in many cases. One nice thing about rent stabilization is that everyone is subject to the same rules and protections, whereas without rent stabilization, you really just have to hope from the best from whoever your individual landlord happens to be. And that, in my opinion, is no way to structure a social safety net. We can get into more in the conversation and with questions, but I'll stop there and pass it along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. Appreciate your comments as well. Folks, and now for our third and final panelist, Mr. Michael Fiorina. Michael?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to serve with my colleagues on this panel. I've never worked in Bell Gardens, so I decided that to be able to present today, I would want to get familiar with your city. So I spent a day this week in Bell Gardens, really enjoyed myself. I ate there, I drove around, visited the schools, and you really have a nice city. And as I said, I've never worked or managed there, but contrary to, I don't know exactly the content of my audience here, whether you're landlords or tenants or both, but contrary to what some of you might have expected, I'm not here to rant against rent control. And I'm not sure I'm even espousing the common landlord perspective on this, because my perspective on this is going to be quite different than what's going on here. rent control is a fact of life, as my attorney colleagues have said. It's been upheld. I've lived with it for 30 plus years as both a landlord and as a tenant. So I have both perspectives. So I do have slides. Gus, can you make me a host and I can share screen? Or can I just share?
Add you on so you can share your screen.
Let me see if it works. Can you see this?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, during COVID, I've really become technically savvy with Zoom. We can dispense with this part about me and go to. Okay, rent control, good or bad? I've been through this for decades in my business. And by the way, I don't currently manage 10,000 units. I have managed over 10,000 units. Currently, our portfolio is around 2,000 units. We manage in approximately 14 cities in Southern California. I Googled rent control, I got 1.5 million hits. I Googled peer-reviewed rent control research, and I got 65,400,000 hits. I'm not an expert in rent control, but I am an expert in its practical impact. And that's what I want to talk about today. So is it good or bad? I don't know. Shane actually expressed what I think is true. It's a very complicated solution to a very big issue, and it's not just one aspect. What I have noticed recently in my career is this. The wealth transfers and eminent domains actions. We recently had the experience of Bruce's Beach being returned, or actually money being returned for Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach. There's zoning, upzoning. There's the discriminatory effect of single-family neighborhoods, SFRs, being exclusionary to certain minorities or socioeconomic status. And then we have the accessory dwelling unit boom, which I think is going to backfire on the state in a significant way. We have the discussion about how construction of artificial barriers has split neighborhoods, such as freeways, the 105 freeway being a common one here in LA. And we also have reparation discussions and, of course, the gentrification issue. So I'm thinking about generational wealth, and there are only a few areas where we can transfer wealth through inheritance, and that's cash, real estate, security, stocks, bonds, and ownership of a business. The Federal Reserve estimates that $350 billion a year is being transferred, and that savings is not the way to wealth building. So I looked up some of the Federal Reserve research. Half of all inheritances are less than 50 grand, and they make up only 5% of the inheritances. So these are really a de minimis portion of wealth transfers. And because I'm a real estate guy, I think real estate is a great way for generational wealth transfers. And I have some, I'm going to detail some statistics. So there's three main assets to achieve wealth. Primarily income real estate is the way to do that. We can also do with single family residences and condos, townhouses, but primarily it's income properties. And of course, and certainly in Southern California, the most common type of income property or most desirable is housing. So why would you purchase if you folks are looking at building wealth, saving for retirement? One of the ways to do that is through the accumulation of assets. In real estate, income real estate is really one of the last great tax shelters we have left in this country, and it's available to everyone. And so you have tax benefits, you have depreciation, you have asset appreciation by market value, and Bell Gardens is, you don't have a lot of units. And according to current CoStar research, you only have 24 vacancies. Not that that's really the actual number, but it's very small. And you have a decreasing population, which is interesting, yet you have a 99% occupancy rate in your city. So I'm going to go through a real quick example here. I hope I don't run too far over time, but let's say that you folks out there want to buy a fourplex in the city of Bell Gardens, which currently has no rent stabilization ordinance. And don't get me wrong, I think it's inevitable that you will have a rent stabilization ordinance. It just depends on the form, and as Norma has gone through the various aspects of it. So assume, and your average rent is $1,200 per month as of this year. So let's do some math, because I love math. 4 units times $1,200 a month is $4,800 per month. $4,800 times 12 months is 57,000 a year. So assume you have operating expenses of 15 grand. You subtract those from your gross income, you get a net operating income, NOI. And then we have investment rates, which we call cap rates, and it's 4.5% currently for multifamily in your city. So you divide that net operating income by the 4.5, your building's worth $946,000. So then assume, we know the greater LA area needs housing. It was certainly established by my colleagues' comments. Bell Gardens has no new apartment construction that I know of, according to CoStar. So let's say next year you're able to increase your rents 8%. $1,200 per month rent times 8% is 96 per unit. And so your new monthly rent is $1,296. So let's do 4 units times $1,296. Here's the numbers. You get $62,000 per year. Assume the expenses have increased slightly. So you have a new net operating income and a cap rate. So you've increased the value of your building by $69,000 in 1 year by doing nothing but raising the rents. If you are able to do this every year, you increase your wealth every year. And if rent control is forced on you, your ability to raise rents will be dictated by the RSO, which according to correct me if I'm wrong, would be basically a ceiling of 3%. The state limit is 5% plus the CPI for the region with a maximum of 10% as was already stated. If the rent stabilization ordinance limits your ability to raise your rents, it will prevent you from increasing your wealth. Most of these ordinances, by the way, are less than 4%. LA's 4%, San Francisco is a percentage of the CPI, et cetera. So let me skip a couple slides because I know I'm taking too much time. So my point is that for building generational wealth that you can transfer to your children, which is certainly my intent in trying to build generational wealth, is to focus on the ability to increase value of your property. And certainly, as we know, in Southern California, post-World War II, property has increased dramatically in value, which of course has had an adverse impact on tenants and affordability of rent. On the other hand, and because I am a teacher, I'm going to ask those of you in the audience who are interested in real estate as a career, here's a quiz. What do you need to obtain your real estate license in California? 4-year college? No. 2-year associate's degree? No. High school degree? No. GED equivalent? No. Elementary school? No. Legal presence in the US? No. All you need is to be breathing, 18 years of age, be honest, successfully complete the 3 courses, pass a sales exam, fill out an application, and pay the fee. I can be reached here.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what we're looking at here is 3 opinions from 3 experts in the field, both on the tenant side and on the landlord side. So what we're trying to do here is identify if what's being proposed for an ordinance in the city of Bell Gardens is what we need. We have 32 provisions that are being proposed. Our city attorney and staff has narrowed that down to 5 major provisions that the state law does not cover. There's several other provisions in there. And as you've seen in your document, you can look at those and you can let us know if you have questions on them. Our panel of experts have looked through these provisions and they've identified that rent control is a good tool to have, but it's not the panacea. It's not the cure-all. We need more affordable housing. We need to be able to attract developers that will construct that affordable housing. But of course, the developers have to make money. We know that. It's a profit business. And what Mr. Fiorina is trying to share with you right now is that has been a way for people to build wealth, generational wealth. And if they happen to see that the opportunity is limited in Bell Gardens, they might end up going elsewhere. However, that does not mean that rent control is not a tool that we need to use. We believe it is. Staff's looked at it. We just believe it's not the only tool. As they've indicated to you, if we do rent control and nothing else, we're not solving the problem. Okay. So we're going to go on now and show you, well, actually the questions and answers. So now we're going to have an ability to ask our panel, if we can have all 3 of them up now. And I'm going to have you raise your hand. We also have people on the chat line with questions and answers. So we're going to go back and forth. We'll get somebody who's here physically, and then we'll go over. So So we'll start off with the lady in the back here. If you could come up this way, I'll give you actually, I think it'd be easier if I went to you. Let me do that.
Yes.
And excuse my mask, but I've been told that my voice sounds muffled with it.
So my question to you all is why aren't you guys approving the rent control? What is taking so long to approve this? And if you can approve rent control, you don't want to approve rent control, if you approve it, what else are you gonna do for the city? Then rent control and what else? Why are you guys hesitating? Why is it taking so long to get this approved? Do you guys not know how many families are homeless? You guys do not know what it's going through homelessness. What it's like to see your daughter suffer, you guys do not know. I don't know why you guys are taking so long to approve this. There are so many families affected, and I am one of them. And you don't know what it's like seeing your daughters cry and stressed out and having to go from one place to another. You don't know what it's like. And I don't understand why you guys are taking so long to approve this. So can you please answer me? Why aren't you guys approving it? Why is it taking so long?
Okay, I believe that is a question for staff and the ad hoc committee. So ma'am, I'll answer that question for you. The reason is we're doing this process to get comments from the entire public. We had 2 workshops. This is the second workshop. Yes, correct. So we're trying to give opportunity for those that didn't attend the first workshop, the ability to also take a look at what's being proposed. So we are now moving forward. After this workshop, we're going to be meeting with the ad hoc committee, discussing the final comments, and the ad hoc committee will then be creating a recommendation for the city council to take a look at on the following meeting. Unfortunately, it takes time. We have to do due process, and we have to consider all of the effects, positive and negative, that rent control would have on the city of Bell Gardens as a whole. So thank you very much for your question. Who else? We're going to go to the panel first on the chat line. Hylas, do we have anyone with a question there?
No, no one has raised their hand.
No questions? Okay. Okay, we're going to go to a question from one of our ad hoc committee members.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Carlos. Yo tengo una pregunta para ellos. El señor Philip dice, y el señor Susana. El señor Philip dice, y el señor Fiorina dice, que se necesitan más viviendas en el Garden, que se necesita construir más viviendas. ¿Acaso viven aquí? ¿Dónde? Cada más viviendas en el Garden, si somos el 85% de renteros. Y dicen que pueden tener un costo de ciertas unidades por 1,200 accesibles. No. Yo quiero saber si Bell Garden, específicamente, si Bell Garden se puede construir más viviendas. No. ¿Nos van a dejar? ¿Nos van a desplazar para construir viviendas nuevas más tarde? Sí, es lo que quieren.
Thank you, folks. Our IT specialist was just making sure that panelists, this is being translated in English and Spanish. So panelists, for your purposes, you are able to hear it in English, correct? Okay.
We were not able to hear the translation on the Zoom.
Okay, there is a item on your screen that shows English. You need to press that to be able to hear the other translation. So let me go ahead and translate for you. Our ad hoc committee is concerned that there's people that don't live here, that don't understand the ramifications of what's happening here in the city of Bell Gardens. We have a community that's over 80% renters. And ultimately, she would like to get the point across that we do need rent control. It needs to happen sooner than later because of the effects, the impacts that are happening to this community. She does know and realize that, yes, there might be a need for more housing, but that's not happening right now, so we need an immediate solution. Is there anything that I missed, Ms. Meadows? Are you okay, Becky? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go on to the next person. Who has a question?
Sí, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es María Romo y tengo un problema de vivienda. El dueño vendió todas las casas donde estamos viviendo y simplemente mandaron una carta que teníamos 60 días o pagábamos el 100% más de lo que pagábamos. ¿Eso es legal? ¿Se puede hacer?
Alice, were you able to hear that in English? No, okay. Okay.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So during, thanks Shane, during regular times, a landlord is allowed to raise the rent however high they would like if they are not covered by a local rent control law or by the state, I don't call it a rent control law, by the state law. And that is called the Tenant Protection Act. And so it depends on what type of house or apartment unit you live in to determine how much a landlord can legally raise your rent. But let's assume that you live in a single family home and it's not covered by the state law because it's not owned by a corporation. A landlord simply has to provide you with 60-day notice of a rent increase that is more than 10%. That is all they are legally required to do in order to raise the rent as much as they like. Now, in terms of who you can go to ask for help to figure out, is this the legal rent increase notice? Is it not? Do I have to pay this? Do I not? There's some resources out there. The Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles is a legal aid organization that supports low-income Bell Garden residents. You can also go to stayhousedla.org. There's also a phone number, which I believe city staff has, that you can call to ask for support. But there aren't very many local resources that tenants can ask for help from. And so one of the things that the city attorney discussed is a rent control board. So if the city of Bell Gardens were to adopt a rent control ordinance, one of the things they could do is to establish a rent board. And that rent board can do a lot of things. They can do tenant education, landlord education, to let people know what their rights are. They could hear complaints from either tenants or landlords around complaints around rent increases or habitability issues, and to help mediate issues that may arise between a landlord and a tenant. Because most of the time, a tenant cannot get legal or technical assistance help with their housing unless they're actually facing an eviction, because we don't have a lot of resources out in the community to support people who are struggling with their housing, unless they're being dragged into court and are at risk of losing their housing right then and there. So that's something that the city can do more of, is to do more tenant and landlord education, establish a rent board that can really focus in on these issues, and make sure that everybody is playing by the same rules.
Thank you, Katie. Ma'am, I know that your question wasn't fully answered. There was another part that was missed. However, what we're going to do is we're going to let everybody know that one of the things that we noticed at the last workshop is a lot of the questions are legal questions. And that's one of the reasons we brought these resource groups out here, including the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. So a question like that, let's go ahead and pose it to that organization. And again, feel free during the workshop, they're out there. Feel free to go out and talk to them if you have very specific questions, or you can also make an appointment with them for a later time. Let me go ahead and take another question.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Padilla. Dentro de la presentación, comentaron en el real estate, es que para que nosotros tengamos un retiro tranquilo, deberemos, nos da la sugerencia de adquirir propiedad. ¿Sí? Yo pregunto, ¿cómo podemos hacer adquirir una vivienda o nuestros hijos tener esa riqueza generacional cuando por estar pagando la renta o de los altos aumentos no podemos llegar a tener esa riqueza generacional? Nuestros hijos tienen que vivir con nosotros como padres, porque ni ellos se pueden independizar por las altas rentas y nosotros quedamos sin el ingreso de nuestros hijos para poder pagar renta y medio comer, porque ahorita con lo de la pandemia y la situación que está ahorita con los precios tan altos, uno de la familia, al menos yo ahorita me quedé sin trabajo, imagínense, me aumenta la renta, ¿qué vamos a hacer? Entonces yo quiero preguntarles a ellos, ¿cómo es que nosotros podemos tener un día a tener una casa si ahorita vamos al día con el aumento de rentas?
Yeah, I've been there. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I was born into a poor family, working class. I worked in steel mills. This is back in Pennsylvania. Put myself through college, put myself through law school. Nothing was ever given to me. And I'm in my 60s, and it's just now that I'm able to do that. So it's a lifetime effort. I relate totally to the issue. I was one of 4 children, first generations to ever go to college. And we did it. And it's tough, and I have kids, and I put them through, and it's not just because I take a landlord perspective on some of these things, which is kind of moderate, actually, the way I am, is it does not mean that I didn't go through that. It's a difficult journey, then no question. But the reason today, instead of really, there are so many studies on rent control that it's impossible. Everyone can cite a new study. I've printed out study after study, and each one comes to a different conclusion. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm really here to talk about how people can change from renters into owners and become landlords as well. Or you don't have to buy dwelling units. You can buy other kinds of property. The point is that real estate is one of those ways. And the imposition of artificial limits on market forces limits the ability to build wealth. That's all I'm saying. And my panelists, my colleagues on the panel may disagree with that, but it's a fact of life because I live it every day. I have lived it every day. I have had dozens of multifamily clients throughout Southern California. That's our limit, our area is Southern California, and it's a struggle. I appreciate the struggle.
I can just add, you know, I don't have much to say to the commenter because I think they're entirely right. And, you know, I think conversations about building wealth in this context are just wrong time, wrong place, because if you can't afford rent and if your rent is going up, you know, for one thing, you have to have a down payment to buy a home. And how are you going to save for that when your rent keeps going up? Not to mention, you know, the price of housing is just so high that if you're not earning over $100,000 a year as a household, your chances of buying just about anything in this region are very, very limited. I'll say I bought a home 5 years ago. I was lucky to have bought it at that time. I certainly could not afford the same home today if I were buying it on the open market. And, you know, I think there is truth to, you know, the fact that rent control kind of, you know, it creates friction in the market and that kind of thing. But I actually bought a duplex. That is the home that I live in. I live in one unit where there was an owner there already. And so I replaced them. And there's a rent stabilized tenant paying about half of market rate in the other unit. I live in the city of Los Angeles, where we've had rent stabilization for many years. And frankly, because that tenant was paying below market rent, I was able to afford the whole building. The whole building was cheaper because there was a rent stabilized tenant. And so I think there's this other side that even with rent stabilization, sometimes this is actually making things more accessible for people, not just for renters, which is the most important group to prioritize because they tend to be have much more housing instability, much lower incomes on average, but also it can create opportunities for ownership as well.
Agreed. But I push back slightly on this, Shane. I still think that it is the time and the place, because I think as has already been said, rent control is just one of the mix of solutions. It's not the solution, and housing is certainly one of those solutions. I think I'm concerned about the state of California's housing policy. I referred to ADUs, as accessory dwelling units, earlier in the conversation. The developers and landlord associations have pounced on that as an opportunity to increase value on property. I think it's going to backfire on the state, because if you're able to split your lot and build a total of 4 units where there previously was a single family residence, you're dramatically going to increase prices, and that will push out low income people in the neighborhood eventually. So that kind of policy is I think it's a shotgun approach. There needs to be a more fluid, complex policy implemented to address all of these things, not this just, we're going to upzone here, we're going to allow lot splits there. I think that's going to backfire.
Thank you, sir. Let me go ahead and go to the next question.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es María. Yo creo que estamos aquí. ¿Sí se escucha bien?
Un poquito más.
¿Ya? Sí. Estamos aquí apoyando, ¿verdad? Porque yo el mes pasado a mí me han estado subiendo mucho la renta, pero yo creo que gran porcentaje de las personas de Bell Gardens somos emigrantes, aunque no es esta no es la plática de migración, pero es real. Muchas personas que estamos aquí y que no están aquí nos están subiendo la renta solo por no tener un seguro social. No podemos elegir cualquier trabajo, tenemos que estarnos yendo lejos. A veces no podemos ni agarrar un trabajo solo por no tener esos papeles, ese seguro. Somos padres y madres solteras también, que necesitamos una ayuda de personas que realmente hayan pasado, tal vez ahorita no están en ese momento, pero les pedimos auxilio por el nombre de todo Bell Gardens y de tantas personas gente también que ya está grande, que no puede trabajar como un joven de 20, 25, de 30 años, que estamos lidiando con este problema que apenas va empezando, porque nos están de un departamento de 1,200, ya está en 1,600, una casa, un apartamento de 2 recámaras están en $2,000. Y estamos hablando que si cada año nos están subiendo el 10%, y aunque una persona que gane regularmente, que tenga su trabajo, cada vez es más difícil esto. Sí necesitamos el apoyo de cada uno de ustedes para iniciar esto. El control de renta, claro que no es, claro que se pueden hacer más cosas, pero yo creo que podemos empezar por esto, por hacer un control de rentas ahora y ya en el futuro poder ver qué más podemos hacer. Pero sí necesitamos, si no, ¿a dónde vamos a ir? Gracias.
Okay, folks. Chat line, we have somebody with a question, Iris?
They actually lowered their hand down, so.
No other chat line, we're gonna go ahead and go to the next person, sir.
Hold on, Brett. I think there might be an
My name is Tony Rivera.
Can you ask if there's a they can hear?
On Zoom, are you able to hear? Dallas?
What about the Spanish?
En español también? Okay, so do we still have the question on Zoom?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My name is Tony Rivera. I would like to set a little bit of the record straight. People say that we're gonna make some more houses. And we was gonna take some houses. No, that the project that we have in Bell Gardens and make more houses are lots that are empty. We're making a zoning for there in the future, they can make some houses. We're not gonna take nobody out. everybody who's in the houses, there's no planning to take the houses out. It's already been in the planning and everybody can go and check the plans. It's empty lots that we are putting on the zoning so we can make new houses. Next is, I would like to hear if anybody has any information. Los Angeles been having all this rent control for years and they are for the homeless. So I would like to know if anybody knows any information about Los Angeles for the homeless. How many, how can we get some numbers out of there? Because I don't think that's the solution. The solution might be making more houses, ask the state to give us funds, and maybe we can make some houses here for the residents of Bell Gardens. Thank you.
Committee members, anyone want to take either committee or panelists this question with regards to Los Angeles and their rent control?
Yeah, and I apologize. I may have missed sort of the first part of the statement, but my understanding is that there was a question about, you know, the city of LA has had rent control in place for several decades now, and there is a situation where we have a lot of folks living on the streets. And I think it goes back to what we've been talking about, which is that rent control is a very important policy that protects folks who are able to stay in their apartment buildings, who have been there for a long time, but it is not the full solution. It is not the silver bullet to dealing with the state's housing crisis. Again, we need to build more housing. That's not the luxury housing that was mentioned by a previous commentator, but that, you know, really caters to folks who are immigrants, who are low income, who work low wage jobs. Those are the folks that need the housing the most, and that are the ones who are the most likely to end up living on the streets. Now, the city of LA has had their rent control policy in place since the 1970s. Because of state law, they have not been able to rent stabilize any units that have come onto the market since about 1976, I believe. And so you have 40 years, well, gosh, 60 years of housing stock, 40 years of housing stock where folks move in and they get a rent increase of 5-6% year over year. That's allowed because they don't have rent regulations on those units. And there has been studies recently, one from UCLA school, from UCLA, that says if we see more than 5% rent increases across the city, we see a spike in homelessness because folks are being pushed out onto the street, are unable to find new housing that is affordable. And so we are going to continue seeing a rise in folks living on the streets. And that is not something that only affects them. It affects all of us. It affects landlords, it affects property owners, because we pay more in taxes, we pay more in social services to help those folks with emergency room visits, for folks who end up in prison and jail. All of that has cost to us as a society and as a community. And so we need to do more to provide housing for folks upstream to make sure that they're not losing their housing in the first place, because we are going to continue paying the costs of high housing costs of folks living on the street if we don't do more. Rent control is one of the policies that we can use to provide stability to folks. Again, it's not the only tool, but it is one of the fastest tools we can reach for to stem the tide that is flowing into homelessness.
And I don't have much to add to that. I think the general point, I just want to reiterate that there is no silver bullet, this cliche at this point to say that, but there is no single solution. Different people need different things. Some people will benefit from rent stabilization, others don't really need it. Some people need rent assistance, others don't. Some people need eviction support, legal support when they're facing an eviction, others don't. It just depends. And to put any one of these things and to claim that it's not going to solve the entire problem is kind of a misframing it, I guess. No one is claiming otherwise. But again, to look at Los Angeles, I do think there's no clear argument for why the rent stabilization ordinance of all things in Los Angeles would be the reason that we have more people living outside of a home. And so I think there's just no rational argument there. As I've said, there are cases to be made about conversions from rentals and those kinds of things, but this is something we've had in Los Angeles for a very long time. And the problems that Los Angeles in particular has with homelessness have a lot more to do with its central location, with the institutions that are nearby, and a whole host of other things that rent control is very, very, very far down on the list if it's contributing at all. And I think if anything, by keeping people in their homes and limiting their rent increases to usually 3% a year, it's protected a lot of people from becoming homeless. And in lieu of rent stabilization, we would probably be doing a lot worse.
Thank you, Dallas. We're getting very close to the end of our question and answer period. We have, I know, a few more questions here and also from our ad hoc committee. Gentlemen did bring up a point on the proposals that are being presented. Keep in mind the rent increase should say that the proposal is 3% plus 50% of CPI. Okay, so right now that 3% got left out of it. So just make a note that it's city, instead of the 5% that the state has, the city's proposal says 3%. So it's 2% less than the state. Also, the state proposal is up to 10%. So CPI can go up 5%. If it goes more than that, it's still limited to 5%. So 5% gives you 10% maximum for state law. The city is proposing 3% plus 50% of whatever the CPI is, which again, if it's 6% right now, that would be 3% plus 3%, 6% maximum. Okay, so just wanted to clarify that. We have a gentleman here that has additional questions, so we're going to try to finish up with everybody that raised their hands. Sir?
Hi, my name is Joe, and I'm a landlord in the city of Bell Gardens. Back in October 2019, the city of Bell Gardens City Council had passed an emergency rent control ordinance, which had consisted of a 45-day moratorium on no-fault evictions and a maximum 3% cap on rents. However, though, the city manager of Bell Gardens had advised against this rent control ordinance, and he had recommended to the statewide Assembly Bill 8314. Therefore, the city council has scrapped this rent control idea, but yet we are here. Furthermore, the American people have voted against Prop 10 and against Prop 21, which were both rent control. But yet, the California politicians have not respected our votes and therefore have shoved Assembly Bill 1482 down our throats. We, the landlords, are suffering financially as well as everyone else. We are dealing with super high inflation, just like the tenants. The cost of operating our business has drastically increased due to high inflation. Please go to any Home Depot, and you'll see that the prices have spiked by more than 200 or 300%. Not just 3%. A 4x8 piece of plywood prior to COVID-19 had cost around $25. But now that same piece of plywood is over $100, along with coffee and paint and so forth. Contractor prices had also skyrocketed as well. And yet, you guys are setting a rent at 3%. We also dealing with the repercussion of Proposition 19, where if a child was to inherit a property, the property taxes on that inherited property will skyrocket. Therefore, city cap on rent, if a city cap on rent were to take effect, the rental housing inventory will shrink and it will be replaced with owner-occupied units such as condos. Therefore, it should reduce the supply of rental housing. Why would any landlord would want to invest in an apartment where they know that their return on investment would be a financial loss with this high inflation? If they are unable to keep with inflation, remember, we are in a housing crisis, and California needs rebuilding housing units. Let's work together. Let's encourage landlords and housing providers to construct ADUs and to encourage the supply of housing. Because the 3% ceiling cap does not incentivize the construction of ADUs. The cost of an ADU is around $100,000 to $150,000. So let's just keep that in mind if you guys want to pass the ordinance in the city of Bell Gardens.
Okay, thank you, sir. Folks, just want to let you know that this is a question and answer period. We do have a period for public testimony. So if you have a question and answer, now is the time. Yeah.
Hola, buenas tardes. Me da mucho gusto que estemos en este foro aquí en nuestra ciudad y les quiero dar las gracias a ustedes, concejalles, por tomarse el tiempo de estar en estas pláticas, en este foro, para ver qué soluciones pudiéramos tener, ¿verdad? Yo soy propietaria y quisiéramos que fuera un convenio para las dos personas, tanto el inquilino como el propietario, porque el costo de vida está muy alto. Ya no se puede hacer unas reparaciones como antes se hacían. Ahora, también están diciendo que quieren que se hagan más edificios, más esto, y acuérdense aquí en nuestra ciudad que tenemos un problema muy grande, el de los estacionamientos. No tenemos estacionamientos y va a haber más apartamentos, va a haber más problemas también. Entonces yo les pido que en conjunto sea para beneficio tanto del rentero como de los inquilinos. Por favor, gracias.
Okay, thank you for that. Again, keep in mind, instead of comments right now, we would like any questions to our panelists. We are going to have a public testimony period. We have a question here in the back.
Hi. Hello, I'm Sandra Garcia, and I lived in the community for 24 years. My question is, so there's been threats from landlords, which has to do with the immigration status, which I know as, we have rights, and that shouldn't be brought up or say, we're gonna enforce whatever it is, but anyway, when you call the city on a slumlord, what happens is I'm seeing that the city is siding with the management companies, because I have AQP management company that has came in, and I've been renting for 24 years in the same home, and they came in and gave me a 60-day notice to move out. This is 2 years ago. I've been through stress, insomnia, everything else. So my question is, how is the city taking sides, with the landlords, and I know it's all benefit, but what about us? What about the tenants that do pay? What about the tenants that do protect the properties? What about the tenants that don't got nowhere to go, that were no income? What happens then? What happens to us? Because I paid my rent, I have proofs. Plus that management company has gave me, I have 60 dwellings. You guys know what that is? Does anybody know here what dwelling is? Where I can't sleep, they're knocking every day, leaving me notice in dwellings. It's not just a 24-hour notice to come in once. It's a 24 hours where they want to have me practically sitting on my butt at home from Monday through Friday, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And for what? Sometimes they don't show up. Sometimes they don't knock. Sometimes they're lying. I've been sending all this stuff to my attorneys. We're unhappy now in our home that we used to feel safe. Our city's not the best, especially with gangs, with violence, with thieves, with tweakers, with everything. You guys gotta do more for us also. I don't want to live in the street with my children and my family. So I understand landlords, but also you guys have to take into consideration all the tenants here in Val Gardens. Because it's not only us, there's seniors, there's other people that are low income living on SSI, disabled people. We need your help and your support for all this to stop. Like the lady was saying, we need to get together and come into an agreement where also landlords don't harass tenants that are responsible families that are paying, and that also protect their properties. Like, I don't take things from thieves. I don't let people come and take over our block. So please help us.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions?
Could I make a comment about, unfortunately, I was not able to discern some of the comment, but I did catch the part about management companies. And being a management company, I'm quite interested in that, concerned about that. There's no doubt that one of the reasons, just one of the reasons that there's so much regulation in the dwelling unit market in multifamily in California is because we have landlords who are bad landlords. they don't take care of the property, they do things illegally. And one of the reasons that we have organizations that such as AGLA and AOA and the California Apartment Association and other trade groups is to train landlords to properly implement the law, housing regulations, and whatever else is necessary according to California law. Unfortunately, these landlords exist. There are, at my last research of this, which is dated, there were over 4,500 property management companies in the greater Los Angeles area. Now, the vast majority of those companies are moms and pops who own a few units and do it themselves. And admittedly, we run into these people a lot, and we try to educate these folks that, yes, they are subject to California law and housing regulations. Some of them just don't buy into that. And the unfortunate result is there's more regulation because these landlords make it bad for the rest of us. So it's imperative that the whatever landlords are in the audience is to retain competent management companies, licensed and insured, trained in fair housing, certified, and obeying California law.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
One more question here, and then we're gonna have to take a question from one of our committee members, and then we're gonna have to keep this moving along.
Thank you, folks. My name is Rick Tsang. I have specific questions in regards to number one, the first proposal of what the gentleman said, that was 3% plus 50% of CPI. The state did a lot of research and decided on 5% plus a full CPI. So where did you guys come up with the 3%? Was it out of thin air, or was it just something that you guys did research on? Because the state already have rent control of 5% plus CPI. I recently researched the CPI back in February, and the CPI was only 3.5%. So if you guys going to do half of CPI, that's basically 1%. So you're saying that you're raising 4%. Yes, we have a recent inflation because of this war or whatever, but 3% is barely enough. You know that there's a mandatory 2% property tax that's on landlord property tax every year, and that's never going to be reduced. So with 1 extra percent, you don't think insurance increase, you don't think labor increase, material increase? If you want slumlords, you pass this. The landlord will not be able to afford to fix any repairs. You'll have more slumlords. That's the reason why there's going to be more habitability issues, because the landlord cannot afford to do so. So my question is, where did you guys come with this 3%, and how do you guys know half CPI versus full CPI? And the second question I have is, you expand rent control coverage. The unincorporated LA County has expanded rent control. So they limited 3% of increase, but there's a moratorium for the last 2.5 years. So basically, any owner that have property in unincorporated LA County, they cannot raise their rent. Not the 3% that they proposed, but for the last almost 3 years, there's no rent increase. Okay, and then also rent control expanded on people that rent their rooms out. So if you're a tenant and you guys are renting your room out in unincorporated LA County, now you're the landlord position. You cannot increase your tenant's rent, and you cannot evict them too. So if you choose to, if your roommate and you have fights, you cannot evict your roommate. So you guys have to think about it. If you keep on extending rent control coverage, you guys now the tenant renting your room out to your friend. If you guys have argument, you cannot kick them out, or you cannot increase their rent. So you guys have to think about double-edged sword. So my question again is, will this expand rent control go into renting your own room as a tenant? Number one, and number two is, where do you guys come up with this 3% and half of CPI?
Yeah, so I'd like to jump in. I can't speak exactly to how folks landed on the 50% of CPI with a ceiling of 3%, but I wanted to clarify a few things. So one, the proposal that is on the table is that rent would be able to be increased once a year at 50% of what the consumer price index is, with a ceiling of 3%. So the max allowable rent increase per year would be 3% if CPI is above 3%. So that is what is on the table. It is not out of line with what other rent control jurisdictions do locally. Santa Monica doesn't allow 100% of CPI rent increase. I believe Santa Ana, who just adopted a rent control ordinance, they also have a percentage of consumer price index, and the same with San Francisco. So this is not unusual, and it is legal. So that is true. Another legal mechanism that I want to highlight, because it hasn't been talked about in this room yet, is that if a property owner, if a landlord can demonstrate that they are actually losing money on their property, the city is required to have a process where the landlord can show that and then have be granted a larger rent increase. That is a constitutional requirement because a landlord cannot be forced to lose money on their property because of rent regulations. Now, what we have seen in the city of LA is that, and in the city of Santa Monica, frankly, when landlords have gone to those cities to petition for a larger rent increase, they are largely denied that rent increase because they cannot demonstrate that they are actually losing money on their property. And so there is a mechanism for the very singular times that that is the case, but it often is not the case where landlords can actually show that they are losing money on their property. And then finally, I just want to go back to something that was mentioned earlier and be very clear that the landlord-tenant relationship is a contract. The tenant pays rent. What the landlord is required to do per the contract is to provide a safe, stable, maintained, habitable property. If a landlord is not doing that, they are breaking their contract. They are not holding up their end of the bargain. And that is a problem that is very rarely discussed or addressed. It's very frequently about a tenant not doing their part of the bargain, but we don't talk about landlords not doing their part of the bargain. And that is really important as well.
I agree. There is nothing more important than the privity of contract among all parties, just not in real estate. However, the United States Supreme Court has vitiated the contracts clause of the United States Constitution, and so have states. It is well documented that clause no longer applies to contractual relationships, and it certainly hasn't applied during the pandemic in California, where contracts, valid contracts between landlords and tenants have been invalidated as to their terms, depending upon which terms the state wishes to change in state, counties, cities, everyone. So, and by the way, the landlord is not obligated to provide a safe, as in security, safe environment. There is no requirement to provide any kind of security on a building, but absolutely landlords must provide habitable units, which goes back to my comment about management companies being competent, landlords being worth their salt. Make sure that you provide a habitable, good, well improved unit so that you can capture the highest market rent. I want to mention two things that are, one is an unintended consequence of rent control, which I've noticed over the last 35 years. And that is that if you own a building in a rent controlled jurisdiction, why would you not raise the rent the maximum every year? So this rent control guarantees an annual increase in rent, even if the economy tanks. If there's a recession, and yeah, maybe you don't rent a unit for a while because you're asking higher rents, but if you don't ask the maximum allowable every year pursuant to the RSO, you will never catch up as a landlord. The other irony is that going back to my slides about the reduced appreciation on an asset, if the asset valuation, the appraised value or assessed value doesn't increase, then that actually lowers the government does not capture as much in property taxes for local services. So there's also an irony in that the reduction in value or the lack of increase in appreciation on a real estate asset thereby correspondingly reduces the property taxes.
Thank you very much.
I did just want to quickly respond on one thing. On the incentive to raise rents by the maximum each year, I feel like this is brought up pretty often. And I'll say it, I think it's true that as a landlord, if you know you can never catch up basically by raising someone's rent by 50% in a year or 30%, then you're going to try to keep up with the market as best you can. Sorry, is there someone?
Yes, we're trying to say, for the sake of time, we're trying to move this along, but apparently.
Okay, go ahead. Never mind. I'm just saying it's not really a serious problem because the fact is that most landlords are raising rent as much as they possibly can every year anyway, and this reduces that amount. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think in my experience, Shane, there are plenty of landlords who raise the max, but there are also tons of landlords, especially smaller landlords, who are satisfied with continued occupancy by the same tenants so they can avoid turnover costs and maintaining the same rents.
I'm sorry, I need to wrap this up. We're running out of time, so I appreciate that. Want to let the residents and landlords know here, what you have before you is not a city proposal. These are proposals from nonprofit organizations that were given to us to study and to look at. So the paperwork that you have there, that is not the city's recommendation. It's what the city's been asked to consider. So I want you to keep that in mind. These proposals, these 32 provisions, the city has looked at. We've identified the ones that the state already covers, and we've identified what we believe to be the most significant ones, which of course one of them is the rent increase. The other one is rent stabilization board. So I just want to make it clear that is not a proposal from the city of Bell Gardens. It's something that we're looking at to consider. Once that happens, the ad hoc committee will take your comments into consideration, both landlord and tenant, and we'll meet very soon after this workshop, and we'll have a position to present to the city council at an upcoming meeting. Okay, with that said, our questions and answer period is over right now. We're going to go forward to a rent relief video. Oh, I'm sorry, you know what? We did have one comment that I left out, Mr. Jervis.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the panel if you've seen cities before. Oh, there we go. If you've seen cities before that create a more restrictive rent control than the state, even though the state's fairly new right now, it's really never kicked in because of COVID. But when you create a more restrictive city, where the surrounding cities do not have this rent control, like this city is very strict, it becomes an island to itself. Do you think that a more restrictive rent control is going to attract more investors to create more construction in the city or drive them out? Because in my experience, the developers will just go build more housing next door. They'll eliminate Bell Gardens, they won't invest in Bell Gardens. And so I don't see how creating our city it's going to be good for the city to make themselves more restrictive than other neighboring cities. So I wanted your comment on that one item to think about. And then the fair and just return is the law. If we have a CPI, right now approaching 7%, and we limit it to 3% plus half of CPI, how are we going to be able to create a negative return investment? We're not going to be able to comply with the law and allow owners a fair and reasonable return because inflation is higher than what even they can raise the rents. I mean, we've got water rates up gigantic amounts in the city. We've got property taxes going up. We've got all the inflation pressures. So if we're not allowed to even raise the rents enough just to break even, how is that a fair and equitable return? So those are the two things, the island to itself, and then how do we just keep up with the need? Thank you.
Sure. Panel, if I could ask just one answer, just to keep us moving along, who would like to take that question?
I can answer, I can answer the first one at least and say that the island unto itself problem, as I mentioned earlier, you can't apply rent stabilization in California to new housing. And so there's really no reason that a developer would look at Bell Gardens and think, well, they have rent stabilization on their housing built before 1995, so I'm not going to build any new housing there. The two things are really just not connected to one another. So I don't think that's a serious issue. And you find that many of the cities in LA County, in the state, actually that have rent stabilization tend to build a lot more housing than their neighbors, not because of rent stabilization, but just to make the point that the two things are not very closely related.
Well, there's more to that story. Building on what Shane said, there's a comma at the end of that comment, and that is that the reason developers are building new housing, first of all, private developers don't build new housing not to make a profit. That's why everything is so-called luxury units. They're not actually necessarily luxury units, but they're higher rents because they need to recapture their investment. But the state law 1482, AB 1482 exempts new housing for 15 years from the date of construction. So that, and developers by a group do not normally retain ownership of what they build. They sell it. So, and they get their permanent financing, and then they sell, because that's when they need to repay everybody they borrowed from, as well as themselves. So there's a 15-year hiatus, and then the property goes subject to 1482.
Thank you very much, panel. We are now going to show you a rent relief video. It's about 7 minutes. And after that, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to have public testimony. While we're taking public testimony,
We're talking a little about the application process.
while we're doing that, is I would encourage everybody to also visit the booths that we have outside. Okay, you can come in and out as you please. We're going to be recording this public testimony because we want to make sure we have it on record. We also want to let people on the chat line know that our panelists have been responding to you. However, there's something that has not been responded to. The city staff is going to go back and look at that, and this following week, get in contact with you. Okay, so I'll go ahead and show the video now.
We'll talk a little bit about the application process here to help make it a little easier to understand. I'm going to talk a little bit about the application process here to help make it a little easier to understand how exactly you can access an application. So who can apply, right? Landlords can apply, tenants can apply. Either a landlord or a tenant can initiate an application. Now, I'm going to talk expressly about the state's program, but I'm going to let you know that most of these aspects apply also to the local programs. Local programs are required to have an opportunity for a landlord to submit an application. In the state's program, when a landlord submits an application, an email goes out to their tenant inviting them to complete their portion of the application. If a tenant applies, then their landlord gets an invitation for them to complete their portion of the application. In some of the local programs, this is not quite so automated. There's a little bit more of a manual process. But regardless of which program you apply to, there is a cross notification letting the other party know. Once that connection has been made and the application has been completed, the application is assigned to a case manager. That case manager reviews it for completeness. If there's any questions, they reach out to get those questions answered. Any additional documents get uploaded. Anything that needs to be resolved so that the application can be paid. Once that has been completed, then the application gets paid. If the landlord does not participate, then the application goes through a little bit more review with our case management. Any additional questions are resolved. Once that is completed, then the payment can be made directly to the tenant, and the tenant has 15 days to make that payment to their landlord. If a tenant doesn't participate, right? So if a landlord starts an application and their tenant doesn't participate, that application cannot move forward. And what will end up happening is that landlord's application, that period will time out, and that tenant may be subject to eviction. So we strongly encourage any eligible tenant to participate in the program. If tenants are unsure if they are eligible, go submit an application. Put that on us. We'll determine your eligibility. You don't have to self-sort your way through this. We have some very simplified screening tools to help folks navigate the income aspect. But otherwise, we strongly encourage households who aren't sure about eligibility to go ahead and apply and let us work through the eligibility issues for you. And the next slide. So what information do folks need? I'm going to start with landlords because their list is a little bit shorter. So landlords need to provide all of the following information in their application. They need to have a lease
or a rental agreement, you need to have something that provides evidence of their rent relationship. We don't require a lease. We don't require a printed agreement, but we need something that documents that rental relationship with the tenant. They need to have some sort of rent ledger, rent statement, rent roll, something that shows the balance of unpaid rents due from April 1st, 2020. So it needs to be nice and clear that we can understand what amount is actually due. And the federal requirement is that those rents be broken out month over month. So we really do need to see sort of a month over month rent due statement. And then they need a W-9. This program is taxable income for landlords. It is rent revenues. So they will be taxed on that. And the program will be providing a 1099 early next year to folks who've participated in the program for assistance. For renters, what they need to provide and show their eligibility is one of the following. So they need some sort of income document. That could be your 2020 tax return, 2020 W-2s and 1099s, current pay stubs. It could be proof of participation in some other subsidized program like CalFresh or CalWorks. It could also be your Social Security information, Social Security certification information. It could be, we have a very exhaustive list in the application itself to let folks know there's a lot of ways you can show your income documentation. If you have no way to document your income, we have a way of taking an attestation. So we can take an attestation of of income earned, or a attestation of zero income if you don't have any income coming to your household. If they're looking for assistance with utility bills, we'll need a utility invoice that shows your unpaid balance. We are coordinating with a lot of utility providers at this time to help make payments through utilities, verifying with your utility providers that the balance is within the eligible period, but we do need to know what that utility balance is. And then if your landlord is not participating in the program, if as a tenant you've reached out and landlord has said, no, I'm not going to do that, or if you're not sure about your landlord's participation, then we'll need some sort of rent due statement, something that shows your rent relationship with your landlord. Again, it can be incredibly informal. We've seen things like text messages and emails. Doesn't necessarily need to be a formally signed agreement, but we do need to know what that rent due will be. Now, as I mentioned, for landlords, this is taxable income because it is rent revenues. For renters, for households who receive funds directly to them as a household, this is not taxable income. So this is not something that's going to show up on your taxes. It's not something that's going to impact your ability to qualify for other subsidized programs. So just wanted to make sure that there's clarity there. On the next slide. So where to apply? We have created a tool, we call it our No Wrong Door, to make it easy to find find out the correct place to apply, regardless of whether you're in the state program or if you're in a local program. So when you go to the Housing is Key website, go through and click the buttons to take you to the application. Just click and apply. And what will show up eventually here is this map tool. This map tool will allow you to type in your address in that top section. When you type your address in, it will then give you a link in the bottom section, a little table. The link will either take you to an additional screening question that will take you to the state program, or it will take you directly to your applicable local program. And that way you'll be able to know what program you need to apply for in order to reach assistance, but then also where do you need to put your application in to make sure that you are engaging your ongoing eviction protections. This tool has been translated, so it is available in 6 languages. So you can find the tool in language. And if you're having any difficulty navigating this tool, I'm going to talk a little bit about our resources. You can see down at the bottom our housingiskey.com, and then our call center, our 833-430-2122. And we have call center staff who are available to help people navigate these tools in the event that they're having a hard time. On the next slide. What to expect for your application. So once you've gotten through the No Wrong Door, and in the event that you are routed to the state application, the first thing you'll have to do is register to get your email set up with an account in our state application tool. So that the very first thing is you do.
Okay, folks, we just wanted to show you that brief rent relief video to let you know that there is still opportunity to get rent relief with the state. There is a process that you have to go through, and if you have any questions and you need help, please contact the city. Myself, Gustavo Romo, in the Community Development Department, I'm there from Monday through Thursday. I know this is a lot of information to take, a lot of information. So I want to make sure that you are aware the city staff is here to help you, to guide you through that. We have these resource booths out here for you till 3 o'clock. Give them your name and number, set up a meeting if you can't go today. But again, they're here to provide you with legal information. I'm not sure how many of you knew that the state had adopted rent control in 2020. Some people that have approached me did not know that. They thought that the city was the only one that was coming up with this, but no, it's a state law. So we already have rent control implemented since 2020. We just want to make sure that it's enough. If it's not enough, and from what we're being told, it's not, some of these nonprofits that have approached us have said, let's do something more than this thing. And that's why we're here today. Okay, that's why our council members asked us to put this together for you. So I want you to make sure that you know, if today is too much information, too much to take within 2 hours, don't worry, we're here the rest of the week. You can make an appointment with me, come see me directly. I'll give you my card, contact the city, contact these resource groups. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists for being with us today. I know they have to go. They were here for 2 hours. They've got busy schedules. Panelists, we just want to thank you so much for volunteering to do this. We really appreciate it. And to our ad hoc committee, thank you also for everything you do for the city, for being part of this committee. We really appreciate you. And I want our chair, who has a few words for you, to let you know also that the city council is here for you.
Hola, buenas tardes, soy el concejal Marco Bárcena. Solamente les quiero agradecer a todos los que vinieron, a los que son los property owners, los que tienen sus casas que rentan, a las personas que viven en las casas que otras personas están rentando. Todos los puntos de vista son importantes y quiero ustedes que sepan que estamos escuchándolos. No podemos solucionar todos los problemas, como ya dijeron muchos de nuestros panelistas, pero el esfuerzo es para ver cuál solución le va a beneficiar a más gente. Entonces, vamos a seguir haciendo nuestra tarea, pero de todas maneras queremos que se haga algo práctico, algo eficiente, que no nos tardemos otros 2 años. Esto urge y vamos a ver cómo lo hacemos para que todo sea justo para todas las personas de 3 años, los que tienen propiedad, los que no tienen propiedad. Y los quiero invitar a que sigan envolviéndose en estas juntas. Como ya no va a haber tantas más juntas, vamos a hacer nuestra tarea y vamos a tener algo para que llegue al consejo. Acuérdense, esta no es mi decisión, esta es la decisión del consejo. Somos 5, 2 de nosotros estamos en este comité, pero hay otros 3. Necesitamos que ustedes también nos ayuden. Si tienen algún interés, algo que quieren que el consejo haga, comuníqueselo a nosotros, pero también a nuestros compañeros, porque vamos todos a votar para ver qué se va a hacer con esto, ¿verdad? Y definitivamente, si ustedes quieren hablar personalmente conmigo, yo siempre estoy aquí disponible. Mi número de teléfono está en la página del internet de la ciudad y yo respondo todos mis mensajes lo más pronto posible. Así que, por favor, siéntanse con la libertad de hablarme directamente. Ok, Marco Bárcena, concejal, muchas gracias.
So folks, for those of you who want to provide, and thank you, Councilmember Marcena, for your words. For those of you who want to provide public testimony for the record, I ask you that you please come up here. And again, you can keep going back and forth. Panelists, thank you for your time. You're free to go. You're free to stay with us. I appreciate that. So who would like to be the first to provide public testimony? Okay, here we go.
Okay,
I have to say, we do have a time limit here, so if you can keep it to no more than 2 minutes.
okay, so soy Sandra García, lo voy a hacer en español. He vivido en Bach Gardens toda mi vida. Tengo 24 años en la misma vivienda. Pido al Consejo que apruebe las recomendaciones de los nueve vecinos de Bach Gardens, incluyendo protección como control de renta no más del 3%, y cubrir todas las unidades legalmente protegidas, tales como departamentos, duplex, trailers y más. Crear un registro de alquiler, hacer inspecciones regular para asegurar que las unidades estén manteniendo. Yo apoyo esta demanda porque soy familia de 5, tengo 24 años aquí, como ya dije. Yo esta casa la llamaba hogar, teníamos paz hasta que la compañía manejadora de Eviction llegó hace 2 años. Nos dieron 60 días de desalojarnos sin razón, sin motivo. Nosotros nunca hemos dejado de pagar nuestra renta. Y esto me ha causado insomnio, tristeza, ansiedad, y en 2 años en la casa sigue en malas condiciones. No es justo que somos inquilinos responsables, pero aquí, ahora nuestra gente, pero aquí nuestra gente, aquí estamos nosotros para nuestra gente y comunidad para apoyar y demostrarles no están solos. Hay muchos organizacionistas para apoyar aquí. Queremos respeto y que no tomen represalia a los dueños, que sea como antes que nos llevábamos bien. Nuestras familias merecen un hogar habitable y que podamos vivir en paz. No más dueños que no hacen reparaciones y que le dicen a los inquilinos si no te parece, vete. Nos chequean crédito, si altos, no más depósitos, no más ridículos incrementos de renta, que la verdad no se puede. La mayoría de familias somos de bajo ingreso, no queremos vivir en nuestros carros en la calle. Tengan compasión y pónganse en nuestros zapatos. Queremos cambios, así como nuestras familias apoyan a nuestras comunidades de Bach Gardens. Así queremos apoyo de ustedes. Según está una casa de renta según de bajo costo a bajo costo para familias de bajo ingreso. Eso es lo que construyeron aquí, que autorizaron, me imagino que ustedes construir. Ese condominio vale 3,100, desde 3 recámaras. Credit check es 25 a 75 dólares, más depósito, más renta. Tener mascotas 150 adicional. Para parking 100 dólares adicional. Aseguranza de inquilino a 25 dólares. Ya no quieren pagar los dueños ni biles, ni jardinería, ni ayudar con el agua, ni con la basura. Quieren no más de 5 personas y así no se puede. El total para moverse uno es de 7,200. ¿Quién puede pagar eso? I'm also doing 3 more for other people and they're short.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yo voy a hablar aquí por 2 personas. Mi testimonio es mío. Mi nombre es María Martínez. He vivido en Bell Gardens desde que llegué a este país. No voy a decir mi edad, ¿verdad? Pero tengo 22 años aquí. Yo le he pedido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de la Unión de Vecinas de Bell Gardens, que incluyen la protección como control de renta de no más de 3% cada año, a causa justa para protegernos en contra de desalojos injustos. Yo apoyo estas demandas porque cada año nos están subiendo la renta un 10%. Incluso entrando enero de este año nos volvieron a subir 10%. Yo vivo en un parqueadero de mobile home. Yo pago cualquier reparación que hay en mi casa, todos los expenses que hay en mi casa, sea techo, ventanas, todo yo lo tengo que pagar.
porque es mi mobile home. So, inclusive, por eso yo tengo que estar pagando, even though pagan, me están subiendo el 10%. So, yo soy madre soltera, estoy con mi hija, yo vivo sola con ella y pues nos están puchando a movernos a lugares lejos donde ella creció, nació aquí. Ella, pues uno está en esa circunstancia donde voy a ir, dónde voy a llevar a mi hija. Nos están forzando de cierta manera, como hay muchas personas aquí, ¿verdad? De que no, a veces estamos sin dormir, porque, y los mismos hijos de uno se están llevando el estrés, aunque uno no quiera enseñarlos. Gracias, este es mi testimonio. Voy a dar otro que es de Rosa González. Ok.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Martha. I will be reading one or two testimonies from two tenants that are not here present today. I would also like to express how very disappointed I would say that there really wasn't any time allotted for public testimonies and public comment. We're all here essentially speaking to a very empty room right now. So I just wanted to express that before I start with these testimonies. This is by Wendy Escobar. Wendy Escobar's testimony is, I am a mother of three, two amazing caring boys and a little girl. As a parent, you know how amazing it feels to hear kids say they want to do something in this life and want to make a difference in their community and go to college. But sadly, my son got his dreams cut short because he saw how much we struggle, how hard it is for us to stretch our check. It was impossible for him to go to college, so he gave up and gave in and decided to work to help his parents out. Now, 3 adults in the house work full-time, and it's not enough because every year in March, our rent is raised. So year after year, it is an uphill battle. It is hard for me to write this, but I ask that you all look at the struggle this community goes through month after month and year after year, that we need a break. We are tired, we're worn out, and the never-ending situation with no relief in sight. Thank you for your time. I have one from Francis Jacob. Good afternoon, council members. I strongly believe that we need rent control in our city. With cost of living going up, it is hard to sustain a home while providing basic needs to loved ones. Despite living through a pandemic, my rent has been increased 2 times within the last 2 years. It's frustrating that there's an exception to accept high rent while many landlords are being neglectful of their building's needs. I have a third one by Vicky Vertiz. Vicky Vertiz's comment is that her family has lived in Bell Gardens for 45 years. I asked the city council to approve the Unión de Vecinos recommendations, which include rent control maximum of 3% per year, just cost protections against unfair evictions, create a rent board that will be in charge of implementing the new laws locally. I support these demands because we have experienced unjustified rent increases, bullying, false eviction attempts, and intimidation over these 45 years by our landlords. My family is on a fixed income with 2 retired and disabled parents, and our country's rising rents are now making our once affordable Southeast LA city charge ridiculously high rents, while our wages are stagnant. We have been living in crowded conditions forever, putting up with roaches, neglected buildings, pollution, and abuse for too long. Our community is 85% renters in Bell Gardens. We need leaders who listen to their most vulnerable residents and who do not favor loud or wealthy landlords who claim they will be poor or that developers will not want to build in Bell Gardens if rents are controlled. This is not true. Don't be fooled by these threats like these. Imagine, we can be the first Southeast LA city to have rent control and be the example for all the other cities. We can be the leaders of our working class communities deserve. I urge you to please support rent control, just cause law, and stronger protections for Bell Gardens renters. Sincerely, Vicky Vertiz, Professor of Writing from UC Santa Barbara.
Mi nombre es Rosa González, he vivido en Bay Gardens durante 23 años. Yo le pido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de Unión de Vecinos de Bay Gardens, que incluye como el control de renta, no más de 3% cada año por causa justa. Yo apoyo estas demandas porque el dueño de esta vivienda me subió $200 de renta. Para mí es mucho dinero, puesto que yo soy una mujer ya mayor y es muy difícil para mí pagar este dinero. Mi nombre es María Cárdenas, he vivido en Bell Gardens por 17 años. Yo le pido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de Unión de Vecinas de Bell Gardens del 3% cada año. Yo he vivido aquí por 17 años, estoy viviendo en Bell Gardens y he vivido en 2 lugares. En el primero me aumentaron en un año $650 y ahora vivo en un apartamento que me suben cada año $100 y es demasiado para mí y todo esto está muy caro. Por eso me gustaría que pasen esta ley de control de rentas, porque yo apoyo la Unión de Vecinas.
Good afternoon. My name is Fiorina, and I am the policy manager with California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, and also resident of South Stabilization. We'd like to make one thing clear: rent control, just cause, and the other protections that we're asking to be implemented in the city of Bell Gardens. It's not a landlord versus tenant issue. It is about having fair laws and protections against exploitative practices, and about preventing people and families from being further funneled into poverty and homelessness. I respectfully request that our leadership in Bell Gardens considers the following. Home prices in the county of Los Angeles have increased in value over 150%, yes, 150% in the last 10 years, and continue to increase an average of 4% every year, while the state minimum wage has only seen an increase of $5 an hour. California has the largest population of houseless individuals, where 1 in 3 unsheltered women experience domestic violence. Los Angeles County has a 20% poverty rate. We must stop talking about the housing crisis we're facing in this country in terms of profit and gain. Housing values will continue to increase, but the devastating impacts of the systemic barriers our communities are experiencing are quite literally a matter of life and death, which was made perfectly clear in the astounding high rate of COVID-related deaths experienced by members in this very city. Of the 18+ cities in California with rent control, Bell Gardens has the lowest median income, the highest poverty rate, and the highest percentage of residents who rent. The nearby cities, Inglewood and Santa Ana, all have a rent control of max 3%. We ask city council members to please center the needs of your constituents and ensure that your residents have access to safe, habitable, and dignified places to live without constant fear of eviction, huge increases, and harassment. Thank you. And I also have 3 testimonies that I would like to read on behalf of parents that were not able to be present.
Is there anybody else in the room? Take one person.
Anyway, my name is Rob Erickson. I lived over here in over 60 years in Bell Gardens. And this rent control system has been out of control. And anyway, we have a lot of R3 multiple dwelling in Bell Gardens. And with this new rent control that you're putting in, restricting everything, what the state has already done in enforced, you want to lower it. How many people are going to want it? Developers are going to want to use the R3 properties to build multiple dwelling two-story. Because they say, when you get put this restrictions on, no one's going to want to come into Bell Gardens and improve the city by building new structures. It's just ridiculous. The gentleman on the street here last time, if somebody came up here, a property owner, he said that, I mentioned this today, about the cost of improvements has gone skyrocketing, sky high. And the one the gentleman last time on the screen, He said that the people are 10 years ago, he bought a property for $100,000. That's true. He said now it's worth $700,000. But you gotta realize with that $700,000 property, now somebody buys that property, you know, you gotta pay $4,000 just to pay the payments. That doesn't include any insurance, any liability, anything like that. So in other words, the rent is gotta go up with the property that you're buying. I mean, people have to pay rent, that's understandable. But you gotta realize, people that buy the property have to pay $700,000 that you be not gonna live in. And then they gotta pay $4,000 a month for their mortgage payment. Plus they gotta pay the fire insurance. Plus they gotta pay the liability insurance. And that all goes up every year. Then how do you expect the rent not to go up when we gotta pay all these other financial expenses? So I mean, and that's right. My second comment would be on your board. Now, I can see you go along with the board, but you gotta have restrictions on that board. What their liability, what their job is gonna be. Because you put a board in position now, but right now you people put in a board in position. But 10 years from now, somebody else is gonna be, their board's still gonna be there. And what restrictions are they gonna have? In other words, can I rent? Is the Jose over here, who he makes a minimum wage? Or do I have to rent over here? If the other guy over here, he makes a regular wages. In other words, are they gonna put restrictions on who we can rent to? In other words, that board has to have restrictions. Okay.
2 minutes.
We're done.
Thank you very much for your time. Folks, before we continue, we have somebody online that wants to make a public testimony. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Yams. I'm a community member. I asked that the City Council approve the Unión de Vecinas recommendations, which include a rent control of maximum 3% per year, and also the creation of a rent board representatives of Bell Garden renters who can provide support and resources to renters that will also be in charge of implementing the new laws locally. Residents in BG and across Southeast LA haven't seen an increase in wages, and we've been negatively impacted by the pandemic, but rent continues to increase. And as a renter myself, I support these recommendations because, like many of us in the room, I'm an illness or a family death or an unprecedented situation away from becoming unhoused like many residents here. And so without any long-term protections, your residents, which appointed you and who voted you in, are at constant risk of financial ruin, of displacement, of homelessness, and very seriously of death. And so this is a public health issue, and I hope that you all are able to stand with people to create a dignified and healthy future for everyone.
Thank you very much. Andy, you go ahead and continue.
Mi nombre es Yolanda Gómez. Disculpen, estoy un poco nerviosa. Mi nombre es Yolanda Gómez. Vivo por 25 años en Bell Garden. Al principio que yo llegué aquí fue una ciudad muy bonita. Mi nombre es Yolanda Gómez. Vivo aquí por 25 años en la ciudad de Bell Garden. Vivimos en un espacio de unas trailitas y lo que yo he notado y hemos mirado que Bell Garden tiene bastantes unidades de trailer. Entonces yo les quiero pedir a ustedes o que escuchen también o que haya también o que se agregue también el control de rentas de ellos. Porque sé que hemos tenido problemas con los dueños de esas trailers y hemos tratado de hablar con los estados. Sí, hemos tratado de hablar con el estado y que nos mandan para un lado, que nos mandan a otro lado, a otro. Entonces yo quiero decirles a ustedes, concejales, que nos apoyen en eso. Gracias, muchas gracias a mis concejales que nos apoyen en eso. porque en sí verdaderamente Bell Gardens tiene muchas trailas y tenemos mucha gente que necesita de ustedes. Necesitamos su apoyo con esos nuevos dueños que cambian cada rato y nos suben la renta y no hacen nada. Y la mayor parte somos dueños de las trailas. Gracias.
Is there anybody else that would like to give public testimony?
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Lidia Chávez. Vengo en representación de las trailas, igual con la compañera Yolanda. La junta pasada yo asistí con otra de las compañeras. Hoy no pudieron venir, pero venimos todos a representarlas. La situación de lo de las trailas, aparte de lo que ya se comentó, la situación es muy, se puede decir, triste y difícil, o que con urgencia ustedes como concejales vayan y se echen un vistazo ahí a las trailas, porque aparte no nada más son trailas, son como 3 apartamentitos, unos pequeños y una casa. Entonces, ahí aparte de las irregularidades que hay, han estado sucediendo muchas cosas, todavía aún peores de las que yo la vez pasada les comenté. Hubo una explosión de los contadores o del contador de la luz para una de las inquilinas. La situación es esta. La dueña que compró ahí le puso todo como media mitad de lo que son trailitas a su propio contador. Le llega el bill a esa señora como de $3,000, $2,800 por ahí. Ahorita le acaba de aumentar porque le volvieron a mandar otro bill a nombre de esa señora de $3,500. Entonces, la señora tiene muchos, como decimos aquí, muchos Mickey Mouse, muchas cosas irregulares en lo que son el contador de la luz. Hay cables tirados, hay también hay como se liquea el agua. La semana pasada en el área donde yo estoy en el apartamentito, tardó como toda una semana tirándose el agua. La señora dijo que iba a ir temprano en la mañana. Mi hijo se salió temprano del trabajo. La muchacha detuvo a los niños de la escuela porque pues quién se iba a quedar. Total, no fueron a la hora, fueron como a las 8 de la noche. Cuando todas las personas se van a dormir. A lo que quiero llegar es a esto. La señora que compró ahí va y hace las cosas a su manera. No, por ejemplo, si sabe que las personas trabajan, se van a bañar, van a usar el baño y todo esto, la señora no va al tiempo que ella dice, va al tiempo que ella se le antoje. Ahora, yo para poder venir aquí a estar ahorita, yo acostumbro ir a correr, yo no tienen que saber ustedes, pero yo acostumbro ir a correr. Vengo de correr y llego a mi casa y no hay agua. Yo me vine sin bañarme, o sea, no lo tienen que saber, pero yo les digo, estamos sin agua. Y ella cada vez que se le antoja, quita el agua, no te avisa. Y si te avisa, no llega a la hora que ella dice. Entonces, ¿para dónde nos hacemos? Y si nosotros le decimos o le reclamamos, luego dice, no, es que yo voy a consultar con mi abogado. O sea, le va a consultar al abogado que yo me quiero bañar. Y yo digo que hay muchas irregularidades ahí. Ustedes pueden ir, o sea, con urgencia, ahora sí con urgencia, ir a echarse un vistazo, porque ahí hay muchas cosas que no van. Yo los invito, o sea, yo los invito hasta mi casa a tomar agua, por tal de que vayan a mirar lo que yo les estoy diciendo. De verdad, muchas gracias. Por ejemplo, para que pues llegue algunos recursos, allá afuera está el contador y vi que tenía una oficina
Mi nombre es Juan Cerate. He vivido en Bell Gardens por 22 años. Yo le pido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de la Unión de Vecinas, que incluye el control de renta de no más de 3% y crea un registro de alquileres para asegurar que las unidades se están manteniendo. Durante estos 22 años he visto cómo han aumentado la renta. En lo personal, llegué a un lugar a rentar y me pidieron $600 de depósito y el primer mes de renta. Era un lugar horrible, estaba lleno de cucarachas y era un lugar de 2 recámaras. El baño apenas lo usamos. Fue una muy mala experiencia. Viví ahí solo 5 meses y cuando me salí, supuestamente me iban a regresar el depósito, pero no lo hicieron. Y como uno es emigrante, no sabemos qué hacer en esta situación. Así que pues ya no pudimos hacer nada. Por eso les pido el apoyo de esta demanda. Gracias.
Okay, this will be our last public testimony.
My name is Ashley Cervantes. I have lived in Bell Gardens for 18 years. I asked the City Council to approve the Unión de Vecinas recommendations, which include rent control of max 3% per year, just cause protections against unfair evictions, and create a rent board that will be in charge of implementing the new law. I support because it's not fair what the owners want to do by raising the rent every time they want. Mi nombre es Jerónimo Bailón. He vivido en Bell Gardens durante 50 años. Yo le pido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de la Unión de Vecinas de Bell Gardens, que incluye protecciones como control de renta de no más de 3% cada año, causa justa por desalojos injustos y cubrir todas las unidades legalmente permitidas, tales como departamentos, dúplex, trailers y más. Mi nombre es Moisés Borunda. He vivido en Bell Gardens durante 10 años. Yo le pido al concilio que apruebe las recomendaciones de la Unión de Vecinas de Bell Gardens, que incluye protecciones como control de renta de no más de 3% cada año, causa justa por desalojos injustos y cubrir todas las unidades legalmente permitidas, tales como departamentos, dúplex, trailers y más.
Okay, folks, ¿tiene uno más, señora? Okay, we have one more testimony and then we're going to go ahead and tell you the next steps and adjourn. Señora?
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Hernández y vivo aquí en La Albina por 40 años y estoy en representación de mi hijo Felipe Jiménez, que es el que renta. Yo vivo con mi hijo. Entonces yo le he platicado aquí al alcalde de los problemas que hemos tenido y los dueños no hacen nada, al contrario, nos suben la renta, nos subieron este mes. Este año nos subieron $95 y ya no se puede pagar más renta porque es demasiado y no quieren arreglar. Yo le dije al alcalde, al señor alcalde, que por favor chequeen más y pusieran el programa que había en el 80, 82, y es un programa que van a ver a las casas, los apartamentos para ver todo cómo está, porque los dueños no quieren hacer nada, solamente que se enfocan en subir las rentas. Y yo pienso que eso no es justo, porque inclusive nosotros pagamos por cositas de pintura, cosas así, porque el manager se hace loco y no quiere arreglar nada. Le dices y él dice que no, que el dueño, que no le paga y que esto y que el otro. Entonces no hay nada claro allí. Entonces yo soy, obvio, que a mí me importa porque es mi hijo y si él no puede venir, pero soy yo, que todavía puedo hablar, gracias a Dios, y estoy hablando por él. Entonces yo sí quisiera que se enfocaran en eso más, como los demás alcaldes que se enfocaban en eso. Esos programas que había antes era muy bueno, que se metían a las casas, chequeaban qué es lo que hacía falta, todo eso. Y ahorita la gente, la mayoría se está quejando, pues es que no. Dicen, así ha oído, señor alcalde, disculpe que sea sincera. Es nomás son puros hablan, pero nunca hacen nada. Del otro, ves que ya van como 3 veces, hablan del control de rentas y no ha pasado nada, cada año más y más. Entonces, toda la gente dice, no te creas, son puras mentiras, nomás están allí, nos están lavando el cerebro, nada más. Entonces yo digo, yo no sé, pero yo he estado aquí por 40 años y sí han hecho cosas, yo veo que han hecho cosas. Lo que me gusta, que alumbraron todo el parque para que no hubiera delincuentes, porque ahorita también los delincuentes se están enfocando en la gente mayor para quitarnos nuestro dinero, robarnos y se están metiendo a la ciudad, a todas partes. Y también eso quería hablar yo, porque yo ando sola, señor alcalde, y yo no puedo cuidarme, ¿me entiendes? Por favor, muchas gracias. Cuando guste, señor alcalde, puede echarse una vuelta a mi casa, si es amable. Ok, gracias.
Folks, we want to give every member of the public this opportunity. This workshop should have been 3 hours, it looks like. But I know that our committee members want to give everybody an opportunity, so I'm going to give one more for this lady, young lady right here, 2-minute minimum, or maximum, I should say. Come on up. Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time. My name is Jocelyn. I am a community member in the city of Bell Gardens. I've lived here for upwards of 20 years. And it's a beautiful day today, right? To protect families, protect renters. It's evident, right, that there's a lot of community members that are being impacted by this. And so I want to ask y'all to please approve what the Unión de Vecinas are proposing, right? Because the city doesn't have its hands tied when it comes to finding solutions, right? And you know, we're here with a sense of urgency to ask for rent control, right? With the max increase of 3%, just cause protections from unfair evictions, and also creating a rent board, right, for the city, so that renters have an active voice in these local policies, but also they're able to be a resource for other renters, right? And as we've seen, like unlimited rent increases and unregulated evictions are damaging to our communities. And there's been an imbalance for such a long time. And there's also this false notion that new construction in the market will reduce the rents, but we have not seen that realistically. And even when looking at the housing element that the city proposed, there isn't enough options for low-income housing. There's not enough options for affordable housing, which is something that a lot of these community members need, right? And folks have expressed that need. And so I ask you that you please act on these community drafted recommendations, because people's lives depend on this. I've seen many community members displaced here in Bell Gardens, and we don't want to see that anymore, especially if the city has the tools and has the ability to stop that. And the folks that we've seen on the screen that were pushing back against rent control and protections, they are out of touch of what we see on the ground. They haven't been on the ground helping folks who are being unfairly evicted, helping elders take their stuff, their belongings out of their home, right? And so this is a big issue that we really hope that we see these solutions, and we hope that there's action, because folks' lives are on the line. Our community is on the line. The future of our community is on the line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Folks, thank you for staying that additional time and supporting your members of your community. It really means a lot to us. The next steps that are going to happen after this, as our council member, Mr. Barcena, has indicated to you, this is not the last step. There's another step needed. The ad hoc committee will be meeting. We're going to be going over all of your comments and your public testimony. This has all been recorded, as well as the chat line from the members of the online community. And once the next meeting happens with our ad hoc committee, they'll be presenting their points to the city council at the next council meeting. This will more than likely happen at their April meeting. There's only one meeting in March. So we will give you notice. Everybody who's signed in, if you haven't signed in, please provide your information. We want to let you know when this ordinance, if an ordinance is presented in the coming month or 2 months, we want to let you know about it, okay? So this adjourns our meeting. I want to ask our committee members if there's any additional comments you'd like to add.
Creo que casi todos los que quedan aquí hablan español, ¿verdad? Sí. Entonces les voy a decir en español para ya que la interprete y después en inglés. Solamente les quiero dar las gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy. Quiero que sepan que este concilio está tratando de ayudar. Está tratando de ayudar a toda la comunidad, por eso tenemos estas conversaciones, este ad hoc, como ellas acaban de mencionar. Ninguna otra ciudad aquí en el sureste está teniendo esta conversación. Nosotros sí, la entablamos para poder ayudarles. Pero no somos sus enemigos, no estamos aquí para hacer el proceso más largo, solamente queremos tener todos los pasos, oír los dos lados, pero nosotros queremos ayudar a nuestra comunidad. Por eso corrimos hace 3 años, por eso nos eligieron ustedes y ojalá estén viendo los cambios en nuestra ciudad. Pero solamente quiero que el día de hoy se vayan con que nosotros somos amigos, no enemigos. Y por eso entablamos esta conversación, porque ni Cartagena, ni Bell, ni Maywood, ni Southgate, ninguna de esas ciudades la está teniendo. Nosotros sí. Y es de todo el concilio. Por eso quiero que se vayan hoy, que no tengan tantas preocupaciones, porque los estamos escuchando, pero sí queríamos tener estos foros para oír directamente de ustedes y de oír de más de ustedes, porque a veces sí hablamos con ellas están en nuestro comité, pero queremos oír de más personas. Y solamente para que la comunidad sepa también por qué estamos o no estamos tomando estas acciones, para que los landowners también sepan por qué o por qué no estamos tomando estas acciones y estamos oyendo el testimonio para ser justos, para ser objetivos y para poder tomar los dos lados, ¿ok? Entonces, solamente les quería dejar saber eso, que nosotros estamos trabajando muy arduamente, nos reunimos aparte de estos foros públicos para tener y entablar estas conversaciones. So I just wanted to let everyone know that we're enemies, not foes. We're trying to listen to our community and we're trying to help. Whether it's passing or not passing an ordinance, we're still trying to help, okay? So we just want to be objective. We want to listen to everybody's points and we want to listen and have some justice in our community. And thank you everyone so much for joining us and thank you for our staff and our interpreters for being here today.
Okay, thank you, folks. And again, the tables are out here till 3 o'clock. Please feel free to join them and hopefully you'll get all your answers. But if not, again, come see us at City Hall. Thank you.